The woman's hands were raw and bleeding by the time the cowboy found her, desperately clawing at the hard earth beneath a twisted juniper tree in the middle of nowhere Utah territory, trying to bury the only remnants of her former life. Vincent Nathaniel had been tracking what he thought was a wounded deer through the scrubland outside Beaver, Utah, when he spotted the figure hunched over a shallow hole in the ground. The late afternoon sun of 1878 cast long shadows across the red rock landscape, and at first he thought it might be an animal digging for water. But as he drew his horse closer, walking slowly so as not to startle whoever it was, he realized it was a young woman, her dark hair falling loose from what had once been a proper bun, her dress torn and dusty, her shoulders shaking with either exhaustion or tears or both. He dismounted quietly, his boots making soft sounds on the sandy soil. But she must have heard him because she spun around with wild eyes, clutching a small wooden box to her chest, like it was the last thing on earth that mattered. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, and there was a purple bruise blooming along her left cheekbone that made Vincent's jaw tighten with anger he did not yet understand. "Easy now," he said, holding up both hands to show he meant no harm. "I am not here to hurt you." She stared at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and turbulent, assessing whether to run or fight or collapse. She looked to be in her early 20s, about his own age of 24, with delicate features that were currently twisted in fear and determination. Her dress, though filthy and torn, had once been fine enough to suggest she came from money, or at least from a respectable family. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse as if she had been crying or screaming or both. "Please just let me finish. I need to bury these things where no one will find them." Vincent looked at the hole she had been digging with her bare hands, at the bleeding fingers, at the desperate set of her jaw. He looked at the box she clutched, at the way she held it like it contained either treasure or evidence. Then he looked back at her face, at the bruise, at the fear in her eyes that was somehow mixed with fierce resolve. "Who are you running from?" he asked quietly. The question seemed to break something inside her. Her shoulders sagged, her grip on the box loosened slightly, and fresh tears welled up in those gray eyes. "Everyone," she whispered. "I am running from everyone." Vincent took a careful step closer. "That is a lot of people to be running from all at once." Despite everything, despite the fear and exhaustion and pain, the corner of her mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "My husband," she said, and the word came out like poison. "My former husband, his family, anyone who might drag me back to Denver." Vincent had seen enough in his 24 years to know that a woman did not run from her husband and bury her belongings in the middle of the Utah desert, unless things had gone very badly wrong. He had seen enough to know that the bruise on her face was probably not the first, and might not even be the worst. He had seen enough to know that a woman in her position needed help, not judgment. "Let me dig," he said, crouching down beside the hole. "You are tearing your hands to pieces." She looked at him with such surprise that he realized she had expected him to tell her to go back, to fulfill her wifely duties, to stop being dramatic. Instead, he pulled a small folding shovel from his saddle pack and began to dig, making the hole deeper and wider, big enough to hold whatever she needed to hide. "What is your name?" he asked as he worked, keeping his voice gentle and steady. She hesitated, then said, "Nora. Nora Edwards." "That was my maiden name. I will not use his name anymore, not ever again." "Nora Edwards," Vincent repeated, liking the sound of it. "I am Vincent Nathaniel. I work a cattle ranch about 5 miles east of Beaver. Been out here tracking what I thought was a wounded deer, but I am glad I found you instead." "Are you?" Nora asked, and there was bitter skepticism in her voice. Most men would tell me to go home to my husband. Most men are fools, Vincent said bluntly, digging faster. A man who puts bruises on his wife is not a husband. He is a coward and a bully, and you have every right to run from him. Nora was silent for a long moment, watching him dig. Then she said, very quietly, "Thank you." The hole was soon deep enough, and Nora carefully placed the wooden box inside. Vincent saw that it contained a small leather journal, a silver locket, and what looked like legal documents. "Evidence," Nora explained, seeing his glance. "Evidence of his business dealings, his crimes. He thinks I am too stupid to have copied his papers, but I did. If he catches me with these, he will kill me. But if I leave them somewhere safe, if I survive this, maybe someday I can use them to make sure he faces justice." Vincent helped her cover the box with earth, then piled rocks over the spot to make it look natural, just another part of the harsh landscape. When they were finished, Nora stood and swayed on her feet, and Vincent caught her elbow to steady her. "When did you last eat?" he asked. 2 days ago, Nora admitted. "Maybe 3. I have been walking since I jumped from the stage outside of Salt Lake City. I could not risk staying on it in case he sent telegrams ahead." "You walked from Salt Lake City?" Vincent stared at her in amazement. "That was over 200 miles, through some of the harshest territory in Utah." "How are you even standing?" "I am not sure I am," Nora said, and then her knees buckled and Vincent caught her before she hit the ground. He lifted her easily, surprised at how light she was, how thin beneath the layers of her dress. He settled her on his horse, then swung up behind her, keeping one arm around her waist to hold her steady. She did not protest, which told him just how exhausted she truly was. Her head drooped against his shoulder, and he could feel the trembling in her body, the way she was holding on to consciousness by sheer force of will. "I am taking you to Beaver," he said. "There is a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Catherine Walsh. She is a good woman, discreet. She will give you a room and ask no questions." "I have no money," Nora whispered. "He made sure I could not access our accounts. Everything I had I sold to buy a stage ticket." "Do not worry about money right now," Vincent said. "Mrs. Walsh owes me a favor. I helped her son out of some trouble last year. She will take you in." The ride to Beaver took just over an hour, and by the time they reached the small town, Nora had drifted in and out of consciousness several times. Beaver was not much to look at. Just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other buildings clustered around a dusty square. But it was far enough from the main railroad lines to be relatively isolated, and that isolation might keep Nora safe, at least for a while. Mrs. Walsh took one look at Nora and asked no questions, just as Vincent had promised. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands, and she took Nora from Vincent's arms and carried her upstairs to a small room at the back of the boarding house. Vincent waited downstairs, pacing the parlor, until Mrs. Walsh came back down with a grim expression on her face. "That girl has been through hell," she said bluntly. "She has bruises on top of bruises, some old, some new. She is half-starved and dehydrated. I gave her some broth and water and she is sleeping now. She will need rest and care, but she is young and strong. She will recover." "Her husband did this to her," Vincent said, his hands clenching into fists. "She ran from Denver." Mrs. Walsh nodded, unsurprised. "I figured it was something like that. Do not worry, Vincent. I will not tell a soul she is here. And if anyone comes asking, I have not seen any strange women passing through." Vincent thanked her and left, but he found himself unable to stop thinking about Nora Edwards. He rode back to the ranch where he worked, a sprawling operation owned by a man named Harold Porter who was fair and paid well. Vincent had his own small cabin on the property, and he spent the evening there, trying to focus on mending tack and oiling his saddle. But his mind kept drifting back to those storm-gray eyes and the desperate way Nora had dug at the earth with her bleeding hands. Over the next few days, Vincent found excuses to ride into Beaver. He told himself he was just checking supplies at the general store or stopping by the blacksmith to get his horse reshod, but he always ended up at Mrs. Walsh's boarding house, asking after Nora. Mrs. Walsh gave him knowing looks but said nothing, just told him that Nora was recovering, that she was eating and gaining strength, that she was still very quiet and very scared. On the fourth day, Mrs. Walsh invited him up to Nora's room. He knocked softly on the door, and Nora's voice called out, "Come in." She was sitting in a chair by the window, wearing a clean dress that Mrs. Walsh must have lent her. Her hair was washed and braided, her face was clean, and the worst of the bruising had faded to a yellowish green. She looked like a different person from the desperate, filthy woman he had found digging in the desert, but her eyes were the same, still wary, still carrying too much weight. "Mr. Nathaniel," she said, and there was surprise in her voice. "Mrs. Walsh said you have been checking on me." "I wanted to make sure you were all right," Vincent said, suddenly feeling awkward. He held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over. "I am glad to see you are recovering." "Thanks to you," Nora said softly. "Mrs. Walsh told me you are paying for my room and board." Vincent shrugged, embarrassed. "It is nothing. I do not have much use for my wages anyway." "It is not nothing to me," Nora said fiercely. "It is everything. You saved my life, Vincent Nathaniel. I will not forget that." He did not know what to say to that, so he just stood there, turning his hat over in his hands until Nora gestured to another chair. "Will you sit? Talk with me for a while. I have been alone with my thoughts for days now, and that is not always a good thing." Vincent sat and they talked. At first the conversation was halting and awkward, but gradually it became easier. Nora told him about her life in Denver, about how she had married Thomas Garrett when she was 19, thinking she was in love, only to discover that he was a cruel man who saw her as property, not a person. She told him about the beatings that started small and grew worse, about how he would apologize and promise to change, and then do it again. She told him about discovering his illegal business dealings, his fraud and embezzlement, and how she had carefully copied documents, thinking that maybe if she had proof of his crimes, she could get away from him. "I waited too long," she said, her voice thick with regret. "I should have run the first time he hit me, but I kept thinking things would get better. I kept thinking I could fix him, or that I deserved it somehow. It took him nearly beating me unconscious last month for me to finally understand that he was going to kill me if I stayed." Vincent listened, his anger at Thomas Garrett growing with every word, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "You got out," he said. "That is what matters. You were brave enough to run." "I was terrified enough to run," Nora corrected. "There is a difference." "Sometimes they are the same thing," Vincent said. Over the following weeks, Vincent's visits to Mrs. Walsh's boarding house became a regular occurrence. He would stop by in the evenings after his work at the ranch was done, and he and Nora would sit in the parlor or on the porch and talk for hours. He learned that she loved books, that she had taught herself French from a grammar book, that she had dreamed of becoming a teacher before her marriage. She learned that he had grown up in Kansas, that his parents had died of fever when he was 16, that he had drifted west working various ranch jobs until he settled in Beaver. There was something easy between them, something that felt natural and right. Vincent found himself looking forward to seeing Nora every day, to the way her face lit up when he arrived, to the sound of her laugh when he told her stories about the ranch. And Nora found herself healing not just physically, but emotionally, found herself beginning to trust again, to hope again. But the peace could not last forever. It was late September when the stranger rode into Beaver, a hard-faced man in an expensive suit who was asking questions about a woman matching Nora's description. Mrs. Walsh heard about it from the owner of the general store and immediately sent word to Vincent at the ranch. He arrived in town within an hour, riding his horse hard, and found Nora in her room, pale and shaking. "He found me," she whispered. "Thomas found me." "We do not know that for certain," Vincent said, though his gut told him otherwise. "The man asking questions might be a coincidence." "There are no coincidences," Nora said. "I knew he would come. I knew he would never let me go. He sees me as his property, and he will not stop until he drags me back to Denver or kills me." Vincent took her hands in his, feeling how cold they were despite the warmth of the evening. "I will not let that happen," he said. "I promise you, Nora, I will not let him take you." "You cannot fight him," Nora said desperately. "Thomas has money and connections. He has men who will do anything he asks. You are just one cowboy. You cannot stand against him." "Watch me," Vincent said grimly. He left Nora with Mrs. Walsh and went to find the stranger. It did not take long. The man was at the saloon, buying drinks and asking questions, showing a photograph of a woman who was definitely Nora, though the picture had been taken years ago, before the fear and pain had settled into her eyes. Vincent walked up to the bar and ordered a whiskey, then turned to the stranger. "I hear you are looking for someone." The man looked him up and down, assessing. "Maybe I am. What is it to you?" "This is a small town," Vincent said mildly. "We notice strangers asking questions. Makes folks nervous." "I am looking for my employer's wife," the man said, his voice cold. "She ran away from Denver, stole some valuable property. Mr. Garrett just wants her back where she belongs." "Stole property?" Vincent asked. "What kind of property?" The man shrugged. "Documents, jewelry, things that belong to Mr. Garrett." "The wife, she is not quite right in the head, you understand. She gets confused, makes up stories. Mr. Garrett is very concerned about her welfare." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Vincent could see the truth in the man's eyes, the contempt and cruelty. This was not a man on a rescue mission. This was a man sent to drag a woman back against her will. "Have not seen anyone matching that description," Vincent said. "Beaver does not get many strangers passing through." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you do see her, there is a reward. $500 for information leading to her return." $500 was a fortune, more money than Vincent would make in 2 years of ranch work. But he just finished his whiskey and walked out of the saloon without another word. He went back to Mrs. Walsh's boarding house and found Nora pacing her room like a caged animal. "We need to get you out of Beaver," he said. "Tonight. That man is not going to give up easily." "Where can I go?" Nora asked helplessly. "He will follow me anywhere. He has the money to hire men, to send telegrams, to search every town between here and California. There is nowhere I can hide forever." Vincent thought hard. "There might be one place," he said slowly. "There is a canyon system about 30 miles south of here. It is remote, hard to reach, and most people do not know it exists. There are some old cliff dwellings there, abandoned by the ancestral Puebloans centuries ago. I used to explore them when I first came to Beaver. We could hide there for a while, wait for Thomas's man to give up and move on." "We?" Nora repeated. "Vincent, I cannot ask you to give up your job, your life, to hide in a canyon with me." "You are not asking," Vincent said firmly. "I am offering. And before you argue, you should know that I care about what happens to you. I care more than I probably should, given that we have only known each other for a few weeks. But I do care, Nora. I am not going to let Thomas Garrett or his hired thugs take you." Nora looked at him for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding on tight. Vincent held her back, feeling the way she trembled, the way she seemed so small and fragile in his arms, even though he knew she was neither of those things. She was strong and brave and resilient, and he wanted to protect her, wanted to give her the chance to truly be free. They left Beaver in the dead of night, slipping out through the back of the boarding house while the town slept. Vincent had packed supplies, enough food and water for several days, and he led Nora on foot through the scrubland, moving as quietly as possible. His horse carried their packs, its hooves muffled with strips of cloth. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, providing barely enough light to see by, but Vincent knew this land well, and he led them confidently through the darkness. By dawn, they were miles from Beaver, hidden in a maze of red rock canyons that twisted and turned in ways that confused the eye. Vincent found the canyon he was looking for, a narrow cleft in the rock that opened up into a wider space where ancient people had built homes into the cliff face centuries ago. The dwellings were still mostly intact, small rooms carved out of the sandstone, with walls of fitted stones and wooden beams that had somehow survived the centuries. "This is incredible," Nora breathed, looking up at the ruins with wonder. "How did you find this place?" "I like to explore," Vincent said. "When I first came to Utah, I spent a lot of time wandering the canyons. These ruins are all over the place if you know where to look. Most people do not bother." They set up camp in one of the larger rooms, spreading blankets on the floor and arranging their supplies. It was cool in the shade of the cliff, a relief from the intense heat of the desert sun. There was a spring nearby, a small trickle of water that pooled in a natural basin, providing them with fresh water. It was not comfortable, but it was safe, and that was what mattered. For 3 days they stayed hidden in the canyon, living like ghosts from another time. Vincent would venture out at dawn and dusk to hunt rabbits or gather firewood, always careful to cover his tracks. Nora stayed in the ruins, resting and healing, slowly regaining her strength. In the evenings, they would sit by a small fire and talk, sharing stories and dreams, learning about each other in ways that went deeper than simple facts. Vincent told her about his childhood in Kansas, about how his father had been a farmer who struggled to make ends meet, about how his mother had been the strongest person he ever knew, working from dawn to dusk to keep the family fed. He told her about watching them waste away from fever, about the helplessness he had felt, about how he had left Kansas because every inch of that land reminded him of what he had lost. Nora told him about growing up in Boston, about how her father had been a banker who drank too much, and her mother had been a social climber who cared more about appearances than about her daughter's happiness. She told him about how marrying Thomas had seemed like an escape, a chance to start fresh in a new city, only to discover that she had traded one prison for another. "I used to think I was cursed," Nora said one night, staring into the fire. "I used to think that maybe I was the problem, that there was something wrong with me that made people treat me badly. But talking to you, being with you, I am starting to realize that maybe I was just surrounded by the wrong people." "You were," Vincent said firmly. "None of what happened to you was your fault, Nora. Not your father's drinking, not your mother's coldness, and certainly not Thomas's cruelty. You deserved better than all of them." Nora looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You are the first person who has ever said that to me." "Then everyone else was a fool," Vincent said. On the 4th day, Vincent rode back to Beaver to scout the situation, leaving Nora hidden in the canyon with instructions not to leave the ruins. He was gone for most of the day, and when he returned, his face was grim. "Thomas's man is still there," he said. "He has been asking more questions, offering more money. Some folks are starting to get suspicious of me, wondering why I left town so suddenly. I told Mrs. Walsh to spread a story that I took a job on a ranch in Colorado, but I do not know how long that will hold up. This cannot go on forever, Nora said quietly. We cannot hide in a canyon for the rest of our lives. Eventually, Thomas will find me, or we will run out of supplies, or something will go wrong. I know, Vincent admitted. I have been thinking about that. There might be another option. What option? Vincent hesitated, then said, What if we do not hide? What if we use those documents you buried, the evidence of Thomas's crimes? What if we send them to the authorities in Denver, make sure they know exactly what kind of man he is? Nora shook her head. I thought about that, but Thomas has friends in the police, in the courts. He has spent years building those connections. Even with evidence, I do not know if anyone would believe me over him. I am just his wife, his property. Who will listen to me? Maybe someone in the federal government, Vincent said. Thomas's crimes, the fraud and embezzlement, those could be federal offenses. If we could get the evidence to a federal marshal, someone who is not connected to Denver politics, maybe we could get him arrested and tried. It was a long shot. They both knew that. But it was also the only real chance Nora had at being truly free. Living in hiding, always looking over her shoulder, always afraid, that was not freedom. That was just a different kind of prison. They spent the next few days planning. Vincent rode back to the spot where Nora had buried the box and retrieved it carefully, making sure he was not followed. Then he and Nora went through the documents, organizing them, making copies of the most important pages. Nora had been meticulous in her record keeping, documenting dates and amounts and names of Thomas's business associates who were involved in his schemes. If even half of what she had written was true, Thomas Garrett was guilty of defrauding investors out of thousands of dollars. How did you manage to copy all of this without him knowing? Vincent asked, amazed at the sheer volume of evidence. I waited until he was drunk, Nora said. He would come home late at night, drink himself into a stupor and pass out. That was when I would go through his office, photograph documents with a camera I bought secretly, and hide the photographs in the lining of my hat box. It took me months to gather everything. You are brilliant, Vincent said, and he meant it. And brave. Thomas had no idea who he was dealing with. Nora's smile was bitter. He thought I was stupid. He told me so often. He never imagined I was capable of planning my escape, of fighting back. His arrogance is going to be his downfall. Vincent wrote a letter to the U.S. Marshal's office in Salt Lake City, explaining the situation and including copies of the most damaging documents. He rode to the nearest telegraph office, 3 towns over, and sent a telegram as well, asking for an urgent meeting. Then he rode back to the canyon and waited with Nora, hoping that someone would respond, that someone would care enough to investigate. The response came 2 weeks later. A federal marshal named John Briggs sent a telegram to the telegraph office in Beaver, asking Vincent to meet him there with the witness and all available evidence. It was exactly what they had hoped for, but it also meant leaving the safety of the canyon and risking exposure. What if it is a trap? Nora asked, her old fears rising to the surface. What if Thomas has connections in the marshal's office too? What if we are walking into an ambush? We could be, Vincent admitted. But we could also be walking into our one chance at ending this. You have to decide, Nora. Do you want to spend the rest of your life hiding, or do you want to fight for your freedom? Nora was silent for a long time, staring out at the red rock walls of the canyon. Then she turned to Vincent and said, I want to fight. They rode to Beaver the next morning, arriving just before noon. Marshal Briggs was waiting at Mrs. Walsh's boarding house, a tall man in his 40s with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He listened carefully as Nora told her story, as she laid out the documents and explained what each one meant, as she showed him the bruises that were still fading on her arms and back. He asked questions, took notes, and when Nora was finished, he sat back and let out a low whistle. Mrs. Garrett, if even half of what you are telling me is true, your husband is looking at serious prison time. This is fraud on a massive scale. There are investors who lost everything because of his schemes. Will you investigate? Nora asked, her voice trembling with hope and fear. I will do more than investigate, Marshal Briggs said. I will ride to Denver myself and arrest Thomas Garrett. With this evidence, I can get a warrant from a federal judge. He will not be able to buy his way out of federal charges. What about the man he sent to find me? Vincent asked. He is still in town, still asking questions. Marshal Briggs's smile was cold. I will have a talk with him. If he is smart, he will leave town before I decide to charge him with aiding and abetting a fugitive from justice. True to his word, Marshal Briggs confronted Thomas's hired man that afternoon. Vincent watched from across the street as the marshal spoke quietly to the man, showing him some kind of documentation. The man's face went white, and he left Beaver within the hour, riding hard in the direction of Denver. What did you say to him? Vincent asked later. I told him that if he did not leave immediately, I would arrest him for conspiracy to obstruct justice, Briggs said. I also mentioned that Mrs. Garrett has documented evidence of multiple crimes, and that anyone associated with Thomas Garrett should probably start looking for a good lawyer. He decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Marshal Briggs left for Denver the next day, taking the original documents with him and promising to send word as soon as Thomas was arrested. Nora and Vincent stayed in Beaver, Nora moving back into Mrs. Walsh's boarding house and Vincent returning to his cabin at the ranch. But things had changed between them. The weeks in the canyon, the shared danger and intimacy, had forged a bond that went deeper than friendship. Vincent found himself riding into town every evening, unable to stay away. He and Nora would take walks through Beaver, talking and laughing, and sometimes just being silent together, comfortable in each other's presence. Mrs. Walsh watched them with knowing eyes and said nothing, but Vincent could see her approval in the way she smiled at them. 3 weeks after Marshal Briggs left, a telegram arrived. Thomas Garrett had been arrested in Denver on multiple federal charges. He was being held without bail, awaiting trial. Several of his business associates had also been arrested. The case was making headlines in all the Denver newspapers. Nora cried when Vincent read her the telegram, tears of relief and joy and release. "It is over," she whispered. "It is really over." "It is over," Vincent confirmed, pulling her into his arms. "You are free, Nora, truly free." They stood there in the middle of the street, holding each other, and Vincent realized that he did not want to let go. He did not want this to be the end of their story. He wanted it to be the beginning. "Nora," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her gray eyes questioning. "I love you," Vincent said simply. "I think I have loved you since I found you digging in the desert with your bleeding hands, refusing to give up. I love your strength and your courage and your fierce determination. I love the way you laugh and the way you think and the way you see the world. I do not want you to leave Beaver. I do not want you to leave me. I want you to stay if you will have me." Nora's eyes filled with tears again, but they were happy tears this time. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since you asked me who I was running from and then helped me bury my secrets without judgment. I love your kindness and your honor and the way you make me feel safe. I want to stay, Vincent. I want to build a life with you." Vincent kissed her then, right there in the middle of the street, and he did not care who saw. It was a kiss that felt like coming home, like finding something he had not even known he was looking for. When they finally pulled apart, Nora was laughing and crying at the same time, and Vincent thought she had never looked more beautiful. They were married a month later in the small church in Beaver, with Mrs. Walsh and the ranch owner Harold Porter standing as witnesses. Nora wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Walsh had helped her make, and Vincent wore his best suit, carefully brushed and pressed. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Vincent kissed Nora like he was sealing a vow that went deeper than words. They moved into Vincent's cabin at the ranch, and Nora set about making it a home. She sewed curtains and planted a small garden, and she convinced Harold Porter to let her start a small school for the children of the ranch hands. It turned out that there were 6 children living on the ranch property, and their parents were thrilled at the idea of them getting an education. Nora taught them reading and writing and arithmetic, and she loved every minute of it, loved seeing their faces light up when they learned something new. Vincent continued working the ranch, but now he had something to come home to, someone waiting for him with a smile and a kiss. They were poor by most standards, living simply in a small cabin, but they were happy in a way that Vincent had never known was possible. They would lie in bed at night, wrapped in each other's arms, and talk about their dreams for the future, about the life they wanted to build together. News from Denver continued to trickle in. Thomas Garrett's trial was a sensation, with newspapers covering every detail. Multiple women came forward with stories of his cruelty and abuse, not just Nora, but other women he had courted or married before. His business partners turned on him, testifying against him in exchange for reduced sentences. In the end, Thomas was convicted on 17 counts of fraud and embezzlement and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. "He will be an old man when he gets out," Nora said when she heard the news, "if he even survives that long." "Good," Vincent said fiercely. "He deserves every day of it and more." Nora's divorce from Thomas was finalized in absentia, the judge granting it immediately given the circumstances. She was truly free now, free to be Nora Nathaniel, wife of Vincent Nathaniel, teacher and homemaker, and no longer a victim but a survivor. A year after their wedding, Nora discovered she was pregnant. She told Vincent one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the desert. He was so shocked that at first he just stared at her, unable to speak. Then he let out a whoop of joy and picked her up and spun her around, making her laugh and tell him to be careful. She was fragile now. "You are the least fragile person I know," Vincent said. But he set her down gently anyway, his hand going to her still flat stomach with wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby," Nora confirmed, her eyes shining with happiness. Their son was born in the spring of 1880, a healthy boy with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair. They named him James, after Vincent's father, and he was the joy of their lives. Vincent had not known it was possible to love someone so immediately and so completely, but the moment he held his son for the first time, he understood. This tiny, perfect human being was his to protect and raise and love. Nora took to motherhood with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. She nursed James and sang to him and read to him, even when he was too young to understand the words. She continued teaching her small school, bringing James with her, and the ranch children loved having a baby around, fighting over who got to hold him or make him laugh. Vincent threw himself into his work with renewed purpose, determined to provide for his growing family. Harold Porter, seeing how hard Vincent worked and how capable he was, promoted him to foreman, giving him a share in the ranch's profits. It meant more money and more responsibility, but Vincent was up to the challenge. He hired good men, treated them fairly, and the ranch prospered under his management. 2 years after James was born, Nora gave birth to a daughter. They named her Catherine after Mrs. Walsh, who had become like a grandmother to their children. Catherine had Nora's delicate features and Vincent's smile, and she was a quiet, thoughtful child who loved to sit in Nora's schoolroom and listen to the lessons. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Vincent would rise before dawn to work the ranch, riding out with the other cowboys to check on cattle and mend fences. Nora would teach her school in the mornings, then spend afternoons with the children, baking bread and tending her garden and reading stories. In the evenings, the family would gather for dinner, talking and laughing, and then Vincent would play with James and Catherine while Nora cleaned up, and they would all collapse into bed exhausted and happy. The years passed quickly. James grew into a lively, adventurous boy who loved riding horses and exploring the desert. Catherine grew into a gentle, bookish girl who preferred reading to outdoor activities, though she would go on adventures with her brother if he begged enough. Nora's school expanded, attracting children from neighboring ranches and even from Beaver itself. She hired an assistant teacher, a young woman from Salt Lake City who had graduated from normal school, and together they taught 30 children, a remarkable number for such a small community. Vincent continued to work the ranch, and when Harold Porter died in 1888, he left Vincent a quarter share of the property in his will, recognizing all the years of loyal service. It meant that Vincent was now part owner of the ranch, a partner in the business, and the financial security it provided allowed them to build a larger house, a real home with separate bedrooms for the children and a proper kitchen for Nora. In 1889, Nora gave birth to their third child, another son they named William. He was a surprise, coming 8 years after Catherine, but he was no less loved for being unexpected. William was a happy, easygoing baby who rarely cried and seemed content just to be held and smiled at. And James and Catherine doted on their baby brother with fierce protectiveness. By 1890, Vincent was 36 and Nora was 32, and they had built a life together that neither of them could have imagined in those desperate early days when Vincent had found Nora digging in the desert. They had 3 healthy children, a prosperous ranch, a home filled with love and laughter and each other. One evening in late summer, after the children were in bed, Vincent and Nora sat on their porch, watching the stars come out. It was something they did often, these quiet moments together at the end of the day, just the two of them. "Do you ever think about that day?" Nora asked quietly. "The day you found me." "All the time," Vincent admitted. "I think about how close I came to not finding you, to just following that deer trail in a different direction. I think about how different my life would be if I had not met you." "I think about it too," Nora said. "I think about how terrified I was, how certain I was that Thomas would find me and drag me back. I never imagined that I would end up here, married to a good man with 3 beautiful children and a life I love. It seems like a miracle." "It was not a miracle," Vincent said, taking her hand. "It was you. You were brave enough to run, strong enough to survive, smart enough to gather evidence against Thomas. You saved yourself, Nora. I just helped a little." "You did more than help a little," Nora said, squeezing his hand. "You gave me a reason to hope again. You showed me what real love looks like, what a real partnership is supposed to be. Before I met you, I thought marriage was about enduring, about surviving. You taught me that it could be about joy and support and growing together." Vincent pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, comfortable in the silence, wrapped in the contentment of a life well lived. More years passed, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. James grew into a tall, handsome young man who worked alongside his father on the ranch, learning the cattle business and proving himself a capable cowboy. Catherine developed a passion for teaching, following in her mother's footsteps, and she took over much of the day-to-day work of the school when Nora's health began to decline. Nothing serious, just the natural slowing down that came with age and a life of hard work, but it meant that Catherine stepped up, and she proved to be an even better teacher than Nora, with endless patience and creativity. William, the surprise baby, turned out to be the most academically gifted of the three children. He devoured every book he could get his hands on and showed a particular aptitude for mathematics and science. When he was 16, he won a scholarship to attend the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and though it broke Nora's heart to see him go, she was fiercely proud of his accomplishments. In 1905, James married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, a spirited young woman named Sarah who fit perfectly into the Nathaniel family. They built a house on the ranch property, not far from Vincent and Nora's home, and within a year they had given Vincent and Nora their first grandchild, a boy they named Vincent Jr., after his grandfather. Holding his grandson for the first time, Vincent felt a sense of completion, of the circle coming full. This tiny baby represented the future, represented the family that he and Nora had built from nothing, from desperation and hope and love. Catherine married a few years later, choosing a teacher from Salt Lake City who shared her love of learning. They moved to a small town in southern Utah where there was a need for educators, and they wrote long letters home describing their work and their life. Catherine had 2 daughters, and she brought them to visit the ranch every summer, filling the house with laughter and energy. William graduated from university with honors and took a position with a mining company as an engineer. He moved to Colorado, but he came home for holidays, always bringing gifts and stories of his adventures. He married late, not until he was 30, choosing a fellow engineer, a rare woman in his field who had fought her way into a male-dominated profession, with the same determination that Nora had shown all those years ago. Vincent and Nora grew old together, their hair turning gray, their faces weathering like the desert landscape they loved. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1919, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, 12 people in all, a testament to the life they had built. By then, Vincent was 65 and thinking about retirement. The ranch was in good hands, with James managing the day-to-day operations, and Vincent spent more of his time with Nora, taking slow rides through the canyons they had once hidden in, remembering the early days of their love. "I would do it all again," Nora told him one day as they sat by the spring where they had camped so long ago. "Every moment of fear and pain and struggle, I would do it all again if it meant ending up here with you." "So would I," Vincent said, kissing her softly. "Loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life." They returned to the ranch as the sun set, riding side by side, and Vincent thought about how far they had come. From a desperate woman burying her secrets in the desert and a cowboy who stopped to help, they had built an entire world. They had raised children who were good and kind and strong. They had created a home filled with love. They had lived a life worth living. Vincent Nathaniel died peacefully in his sleep in 1923 at the age of 69, with Nora holding his hand. He had lived long enough to see all 3 of his children settled and happy, to hold multiple grandchildren, to know that the family he had helped create would continue long after he was gone. Nora lived another 5 years after Vincent's death. She stayed in their home on the ranch, surrounded by family, teaching occasional lessons to the youngest grandchildren, telling stories about their grandfather and about the wild early days in Utah Territory. She told them about the day Vincent found her digging in the desert, about how he had asked her who she was running from, about how he had saved her life and given her a future. When Nora Nathaniel died in 1928 at the age of 70, she was buried next to Vincent in the small cemetery in Beaver, under a cottonwood tree with a view of the red rock canyons they had loved. Her tombstone read, "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher, and friend." She ran toward freedom and found love. Their children and grandchildren continued the legacy they had built. The ranch prospered for generations, always staying in the Nathaniel family. The school that Nora had started continued to educate children in the area, eventually becoming part of the public school system. The story of how Vincent and Nora had met, how they had fought against injustice and built a life together, was passed down through the family, a reminder of courage and love and the power of second chances. In the end, Vincent and Nora's love story was not about dramatic rescues or grand gestures, though it had started with both. It was about two people who chose each other every day, who built a life together one moment at a time, who faced challenges with courage and joy with gratitude. It was about finding home not in a place but in a person, about creating family not just through blood but through love and commitment. It was a love story that began with a question in the desert and ended with a legacy that would last for generations, a testament to what is possible when two people refuse to give up on each other or on hope. And in the Red Rock Canyon south of Beaver, Utah, if you know where to look, you can still find the ruins where Vincent and Nora hid all those years ago. Locals say that sometimes on quiet evenings, you can feel their presence there. Two souls who found each other in the wilderness and built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. It is just a story, of course, the kind that gets passed down and embellished over time. But those who visit the ruins and feel the peace of that place like to think it is true. That love, like Vincent and Nora's, leaves an imprint on the land itself, a reminder that even in the hardest times, hope and love can triumph. Their story became part of the history of Beaver, Utah, remembered and retold, a source of inspiration for anyone who had ever felt trapped or hopeless or afraid. It reminded people that courage comes in many forms, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to stop and ask someone who they are running from, and then help them find their way to freedom. Vincent and Nora's great-great-grandchildren still live in Utah, some on the original ranch property, some scattered across the state and beyond. They carry with them the stories of their ancestors, the knowledge of where they came from, the understanding that they are the descendants of two people who refused to accept the limitations that society tried to place on them. They are the living proof that love, real love, the kind that sees you at your worst and loves you anyway, the kind that stands beside you in danger and in joy, the kind that builds and nurtures and protects, that kind of love can create miracles. And so the story of Vincent Nathaniel and Nora Edwards, two people who found each other in the Utah desert in 1878, continues to resonate more than a century later, a reminder that the most powerful force in the world is not money or power or violence, but the simple, profound act of one person choosing to love and protect another, no matter the cost.